Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Deer Hunting Podcast, episode number 100. A tribute to Lane Benoit, part 2. Stay tuned for part 3 tomorrow. Big Buck Registry is a virtual museum of hunting stories. We preserve a piece of Americana by interviewing and recording hunters about their hunts and experiences from across the country. And who knows, maybe we'll learn a thing or two along the way that'll help us take our hunt to the next level. Welcome to episode number 100, a tribute to Lane Benoit, part 2. Paul Dupuis was Lane's last cameraman. And in the aftermath of Lane passing, we decided that it would be worthwhile for the North American Tracker Project people to get together and just talk about Lane. I was a part of the North American Tracker Project. Lane had asked me personally to join. Of course, I said yes. So in a small cabin in central New Hampshire, we joined together and feasted on Lane's last buck. We had venison, we drank wine, and we told stories about Lane. And the most stories come from Paul. As you can imagine, being a cameraman for Lane Benoit, there's probably nobody better to tell the idiosyncrasies of Lane Benoit than Paul Dupuis. So I met with Kyle Burns, who is the Prostaff taxidermist, John Dockowitz, the Prostaff mechanic, and Paul Dupuis, the field production coordinator and the cameraman for Lane for the last couple of years. Paul had some amazing insights about how Lane went about his daily business, and he opens up and tells it all over dinner. So I broke the entire 2-hour dinner down to just 1 hour, and took out some of the best spots and best clips that I thought were the most entertaining and gave us the most insight as to how Lane led his life. Meet Johnny, Lane's Prostaff mechanic.
So I was working on it.
Yeah.
Next thing I know, it's in the lift and we're doing work. And the next thing I know, he took it for spin and somebody replaced did some work on the rear end of that and put a different yoke on it. So the drive shaft slipped off.
Gotcha.
And I said, let go. I said, well, you have a lot of slack on it. You have a lot of miles on this thing. And I just repowered that truck. And right before he passed, he came over and picked it up, drove it home. The truck was been sitting for what? Over a year.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That was the vehicle he had before he got the truck?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was his hunting rig.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lane in a Japanese vehicle.
When I first started driving the FJ, Lane wasn't big on it because he said he wasn't going to drive any Japanese vehicles. He was partial to his Chevy.
Right.
And one season in it, he loved it. And then when John started doing the modifications, he really loved it. And I told him, I said, well, why don't we bring John on as our Prostaff mechanic?
Right.
He says, Prostaff mechanic? What do you mean? I says, well, I said trade and barter will, knowledge and,
Yep.
money and whatever. And, because we're going to build this. Because if you're not growing, you're dying.
Right. Wrapping the truck, telling Lane he can't.
And shortly after that, Lane and I came up with the idea of starting to go around to dealerships.
Oh, yeah.
We had half a dozen people tell us, oh, you can't do that. Dealerships never give you anything.
Right.
So we ended up going to Capital City GMC up in Montpelier.
Yeah.
And they ended up putting them in a lease at an employee rate, and then they paid $4,000 to have the thing totally skinned, camouflage,
That's awesome.
and all the other stuff. And Lane was just kind of like shaking his head.
Let me get this straight. Somebody told Lane he couldn't.
Yeah, well, that's the bite of the apple. You tell Lane it can't be done, and then there he goes ahead and he wants to do it. And then the day we went in to finalize what we were going to put on the truck,
Yep.
we were asking them what they, when we went into the detailer that they used, we asked them what they charged to do it, and they told us. And then they said, "Oh, but we can't afford." And then Lane approached them. "Well, you want to do some advertising on the vehicle? This Capital City GMC has it on there, and they okayed us to sell some spots on the vehicle." And I said, "Well, no, we can't do that, And I came up with the idea of, well, what about if we have you wrap Lane's other truck, and then you put after you wrap the Blazer,
Right.
then you put advertising on both of them." And they agreed to it. And so that was supposed to happen this spring.
A visit to the gun shop, turning the celebrity on and off.
It was a real neat piece of artwork the day that we went to Perro's gun shop. And we were shooting pieces for the DVD.
Yep.
I had set his truck up, angled at the front door, and my FJ with my sticker with magnets for master trackers on it, angled in at the door, and we did a little photo op there for a second. And the store was totally dead. We had parked the cars around back, and we brought them up and we wedged them in there and we started doing the photo shoot. They had like 50 people in the store by the time we were done, and they were just like, "Hey, you guys got to stay." And we're like, "What?" It's like, "Yeah, you guys are really doing good for the store. Why don't you stay a while?"
It is crazy how he just had this celebrity about him. I don't think he really even knew it.
Went to a wedding.
He would turn it on and off.
Yeah. The Reach and the Landscapers.
Probably one of my biggest shockers with it when I was down in Westport about 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I'm with Wendy, and we're stopping by one of her friend's kids' house to pick up a jacket that one of her sons left at it.
Yeah.
It's like a $5 million house.
Yeah.
Looks like something out of, the Beverly Hillbillies,
I was about to put a sauna in there.
I'm sorry, Johnny. Want me to open the door, buddy?
Oh, but thanks for asking.
Okay. So I'm sitting there waiting for Wendy to come back out. By the time she came back out, there's like 8 guys around the truck. And here are all these landscapers, the guys that own the landscaping company in Westport. The one guy comes around and he says, "What do you do with the Benoits?" He says, "Where do you get one of them stickers?" I says, "Well, if you're on Prostaff, you get one." I said, "It's a magnet." He says, "Oh, you're on Prostaff." And then he started talking. Here these guys were all, and I'd run into that when I was in Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire, but that was the first time that close to New York City I ran into that.
Yeah. Wow.
And they were diehard.
It's amazing the reach that they had.
Well, and when I lived in central Pennsylvania, I lived there when I found out about them.
Yeah.
And when I retired from the prison,
Right.
and then, a couple years afterwards, I started filming for Lane. I was talking to one of the guys that I used to hunt with. I said, "Yeah, you're not going to believe what happened, man." I said, I hooked up with Lane Benoit, and I'm filming for him. He's like, "What?" Next thing you know, I'm getting like 40 phone calls, all the guys I worked with. "What the hell are you doing, Frenchie?"
Meet the taxidermist, Kyle Burns.
I'm the guy that plays with all the dead animals.
You play with a dead animal.
Yeah.
So
Give him the whole smell.
the taxidermist.
Yeah. I started out, there was a little chainsaw shop down here in Leominster. And Paul come in one day getting parts for his. Of course, being hunters, start talking. He asked me, he goes, "You know the Benoits?" "Well, of course I do, He goes, "Oh, I'm Lane Benoit's videographer." I said, "Oh, really?" "And I'm a taxidermist." And we just hit it off. We turkey hunted that spring. This would have been the 3rd year we turkey hunted together with Lane.
Mm-hmm.
And did all Lane's taxidermy.
Yeah.
Do all Paul's.
Originally, I'd asked him, I said, "Lane," I said, "this guy Kyle, he's a taxidermist." I said, "I think we should we need a Prostaff taxidermist." "Well, I don't want just anybody doing my stuff." I said, "I don't want to pay a lot." Lane's cheap.
That's an understatement.
So anyway, he said, "Well, maybe I'll let him do one, and then we'll see what we do, or see how he does with it."
Yeah.
He got the first buck back, and he was just in awe. He was just like, you know how many bucks I got mounted? He says, you know my house, Paul. He says, that kid, he knows what he's doing, and he's young. So he's going to keep perfecting it. He says, and he's already really good. You better get hold of him. Make sure that we keep him. Next thing I know, the next show, I didn't even know you were doing Larry's tribute buck until it showed up. So one of the sets of sheds that Lane had of his dad's, Kyle went ahead and mounted it with another cape and did a tribute buck.
Kyle, how'd you get your skill set? You just don't walk into taxidermy every day with it.
I went to taxidermy school in Evansburg, Pennsylvania.
Oh, no kidding.
For a year.
That's cool. Must be good.
That's when you met John, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's how I met Johnny, yeah.
Yeah, we went there.
The cameraman, Paul Dupuis. Paul, you spent more time with Lane. Probably most men should spend with Lane Benoit, especially recently. So
they spent
last 5 years. Average 6 months out of the year.
Right. How did you first meet Lane?
Well, I was like a lot of guys. I was a fan of the Benoits for years, and when I was in the Iraq War, I had certain disabilities that eventually, over time, pushed me to the point where I went 100%, and I retired.
Yep.
And the year after I retired, I was at a sportsman show down in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and I met Dave Coker.
Down at the Great American Outdoor Show?
That's right.
Yep.
And built a friendship up with Dave, saw Dave a few times. And then 5 years ago at the Hartford show, I ran into Dave and I said, Dave, what's up with these Benoits? They're never at any of the shows I go to. Yeah. He said, well, Lane's sitting right there. And I turned to my brother and I said, Danny, I'll see you later. I'm going to go get a job. He says, what are you talking about?
Really?
I said, I'm not married. I don't have I don't need a paycheck.
Yeah.
I said, I don't care if I'm camp cook, scout, whatever he wants to do, videographer. I don't care. I'm going to do it. So I went over and I introduced myself to Lane and Irene. And initially he told me, no, I don't need anything. But I was persistent. And I went ahead and I wrote down my contact information. And I gave it to Lane. I said, if you need anything, scouting anything, you let me know. I'd just love to be in camp with you guys. Yeah. I want to learn how to track. You guys, you give just enough teasing in the videos, but not enough to really know how to do it.
That's true.
So about 6 months after that, Lane actually called me and said, hey, we need a new videographer. We're having a barbecue at my house this weekend. Why don't you come up, use my camera, film, and we'll let our producer look at it, and we'll pick whoever's the best.
See how you do.
So I called my brother, and I told him, hey, we're going to a barbecue at the Benoits. And he called his boss and told him that he wasn't working that weekend, and we drove up, and I filmed. And a couple of weeks after I filmed it, Lane called me up, and he says, yeah, you got it if you want it. And that's how it started out. I bought my own equipment and really didn't know anything.
Gotcha.
And just started following Lane around and just watching, taking notes. Yep. And he used to joke around about it all the time. He says, you like a TV reporter or something? You're always taking notes. I said, no, I don't want to forget what you're teaching me.
That's true.
And, Lane had paying clients that would pay up to $500 a day to go tracking with him.
Right.
So I knew what I had going on was a valuable thing. My girlfriend didn't think so at the time. She says, you're not getting paid to do this. I said, you don't understand. People pay $500 a day to hunt with this guy.
Right.
I said, so just look at his $500 a day every day that I'm out there with him. Well, Lane and I, the first year, I really messed up the first chance I had to film Lane killing a buck. Gotcha. I was so nervous that when the buck came down, I had it in the viewfinder. And I'm filming it, and Lane's like, do you got it? And I hit record, and I was so nervous, I didn't realize it. I hit the button twice, and it came on, and it recorded, and boom, Lane shot. And I'm looking at the camera, and it says standby. So I hit record again, and I turn over, and I was like, Lane, I think I just missed the kill shot. Oh. I have the footage. I mean, if looks could kill, I would be dead. But Lane had this thing with me where I believe that he gave me more leeway than other people because he knew about being a disabled vet and just all that. And he saw how hard I was on myself about missing it, that he cut me slack. And then the next year I got it right. And the next year after that I got it right. And each year as I went out with Lane, when we'd go out, every time we got out of the vehicle, he was an excellent mentor. Every time we got out of the vehicle and he would do his initial assessment on the track, he'd come over and be like, okay, tell me what you see. And I would tell him what I thought I knew. And then he'd tell me what I didn't know. He would, tell me what was actually there, how I could tell in between. And, at the end of 5 years this past season, he told me, you got 95% of it. I'm cutting you loose.
Wow.
The anatomy of a deer track.
But when I think back to when I first started going out with Lane, to me, a deer track was a deer track. Now, when I look at a deer track, I know if it's a buck or it's a doe, if it's an immature male or an older male, how much it weighs, and you give me a quarter of a mile, I'm going to tell you what he's got on his head.
Awesome.
Just by the way he positions his feet when he goes through, and Lane and I just had a working understanding with it. And what we started to bring to the table at the end of it was, one of the advantages I had of being a fan before I ever worked with Lane is I knew what his fans wanted to see and what they weren't getting.
Yeah.
Being taught step by step how to do the bucks.
Right.
So Lane and I started to work on a 3-book series, and we were going to do a 3 DVD series of beginner, intermediate, and expert.
Gotcha.
And another one of the questions that we had when we go to the sportsman shows a lot is they would say, well, that's fine for you guys that can track all these big woods, but I have small portions of land. So this last year, Lane and I purposefully hunted 2 different states that we knew we were only going to be able to hunt, like 40-acre parcels.
Yeah.
Pieces of ground that we never went to. We were only there for a week. We only had 2-3 days worth of good scouting, and then you were sitting on what you found.
Right.
And we did that out in Wisconsin, and we did it in North Carolina, and we filmed it all for these DVDs. So Lane, it's a shame that he passed because we were just getting ready to go into a whole new aspect that the Benoit brothers never did, which was actually detail teaching people how to do what they do, no matter what the circumstances, whether you're in really big woods. Because, truthfully, when Larry and the boys were really smashing them in Maine, it was in the early 70s, the heyday of it. And then late 70s, the heydays of Vermont. Yeah. And those days are gone. You got woods go through cycles of when big deer are there. Now, Lane still went to those states and got big bucks. But I tell you what, for every big buck that I was with Lane that he shot, we probably had 2 weeks worth of driving, just checking tracks. We would stop and look at tracks all day long, and we might go 3 days before Lane actually saw a track that he got excited enough about to say, okay, we're going to follow it. And, 2 out of 3 times we'd follow that buck, and within a quarter mile, he'd get to a tight patch. He wouldn't put his hooves together to turn his head when he's going through the tight stuff, or he would go through narrow stuff. And then Lane would just be like, no, we're not following him anymore. And we'd turn around.
We got to go further. We'll be right back.
This year we had this one buck. He wanted to go hunt a spot that him and his dad had hunted in his youth. Yeah. And the logging road was long since gone. We used our winch on my FJ 5 times to get us up into where we went, because we just kept getting buried. And he's like, no, we got to go farther. We got to go farther. So after the 5th time that we winched it through, we got to a part where a tree was down, and we were going to have to cut the tree to get through. And I'm going over and I'm looking at the tree, and there's this buck track on the other side of the tree. And I'm like motioning with my hands to Lane, come here, there's a big buck over here, And he's like, what? And so I was like, there's a big buck over here. And he's like, shh, puts his hands, don't. So anyway, he comes over and he looks at it. He says, there's a tight patch right up over this ridge. He says, we got to go up about 100 yards and just see what he's going through to see if he's worth following. He says, we'll be right back. I said, really? And anytime Lane, I should have known better. Anytime Lane says we're going to be right back, we're not right back. the short end of the story is, in a period of 5 hours, we made it all the way to the top. This buck went up, bedded down with 2 mature moose. We got the moose on footage. I'm watching these moose. Next thing you know, this buck just jumps out of nowhere, and all I had on film was the tail going over the other side. We're looking at our watches. At that point, it was 2.5 hours into it, and it was going to take another 2.5 to get down.
Yeah.
Did I mention we left the doors open on my truck and my vehicle was running and the lights were on?
We'll be right back.
Because Lane said, we're just going over this ridge 100 yards. We'll be right back. I'm wearing a vest. I'm wearing an orange vest. I don't even have a coat. And when we got all the way to the top, I was like, Lane, don't you think we should have got... He says, well, you were a survival instructor. He says, I'm not worried about it. You'll just make one of them snow huts and we'll be okay. He says, you'll be out of gas. But he says, we can hike out of here. It's no problem. Yeah, we're 20 miles from the closest good logging road. Yeah. It was insane. But it was just... When Lane got to the point where he saw something he liked, it didn't matter how far we were or didn't even... The idea of how long of a drag it was never even came into his mindset.
The Pectacals of a Wreck.
And Lane would start saying things. He says, okay, he says, now look at that deer through your scope. He says, look at that thing's pectacles. He says, see how big those are? He says, that's how big he's going to be next year. He says, you can't just, he says, if you're going to look at the rack, look at the right part of the rack.
Right.
If his pectacles are, close to the same size of what the beam is, he's getting pretty close to being done.
Yeah.
He says, but if you look at him and he spoons way out and his pectacles are huge, and you're in an area that that isn't going to get hammered, and I tell you what, nobody in their right mind would hunt half the places Lane and I hunted, because it was 5 to 10 hours worth of trekking.
Right.
And most guys, they get in a mile and they're just like, I'm not dragging anything out of here.
Right.
So they turn around. But that's where the Holy Grail. Yeah. That's where you find the big stuff. When you finally get to
hitting the buck sign.
Yeah. When you get to where everyone else gives up, you keep going a little while longer, and sure enough,
that's where they are.
Lane and I found a spot this year where we stayed in my camper because nobody else was staying out in that area, and we managed to drag my camper out this logging road in the snow.
Yeah.
And it was -12. We had propane the first 2 days. We stayed a week. I had a -40 military bag, and Lane was just like, oh, we don't need that. We got propane. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no way the propane's going to last that long. I keep extra blankets and another military sleeping bag in my truck, so I ended up giving that to him.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask you, what'd you give to Lane?
No, I gave another military bag.
Each other tight.
No.
2 memorials, 1 farm.
2 different memorials. And I want to plant one at Scott's where Larry shot his last buck.
Yep.
And plant another one.
That's a good idea.
Right where Lane shot his last buck. Because they were both on the same farm. They both shot their last deer on the same farm.
Right.
About
that's messed up.
2 miles apart from each
Never
other.
thought of that.
Yep.
That's crazy.
Yep.
That's a good idea, though. You won't find too many memorial markers in the woods dedicated to old hunters.
Yep.
That's a great idea.
Now, Larry was famous for when he would kill a deer someplace, he'd carve his name in the tree.
Would he really?
And when Lane and I went back this year, the tree that he cut down, Scott had in his house.
Really?
He cut it down and he, had it, like how you do like a mount on a deer or something like that, but it was, a section of a tree and it had, the LEB on it.
Wow. No kidding.
And actually, Kyle did that with the memorial buck. He did a log or a large branch underneath it and carved LEB underneath it.
That's awesome.
The Memorial Buck for Lane, a tribute to Larry Benoit, Kyle's debut.
Lane didn't like it. I don't know that guy. He ain't ever done anything for me. Hell, Kyle gives me the shirt off his back. I never had a deer turned around like that. And then to have it look like it does?
Yeah, that memorial buck for Larry. Approaching Lane with the idea, I want to do it for a show in Maine.
Yep.
At the Sportsman, or Cabela's. And I was like, yeah, it's in August, I said, it's just an idea I had. So I want to do a pedestal mount for you in tribute for your dad. He goes, yeah, I like that idea. He said, I'll look in the house, and he said, I'll find a set of sheds he found or an old rack he has or something. And he goes, I'll get a hold of you. So, okay. Next day, he calls me back. He goes, hey, he said, Dad found this rack way back in the 60s. He goes, I've always had it in the house. He goes, I want you to do it. I said, okay. I said, next time you're down this way, I said, stop in. I said, I'll pick it up.
Yep.
He goes, when's your show? And I said, it's in August. I said, that's what I'm aiming to do it for, is the show, competition.
What time of year was this that you were talking?
Now.
Gotcha.
And he goes, well, I want it for the Rutland show. I said, all right, when's that? He goes, 2 weeks. I'm like, Lane, I said, I don't even got a cape. I said, I got to order a cape. I said, I got to order everything. I said, it takes a week for them to dry. He goes, you do what you got to do and let me know if you need anything. He said, I'm dropping the horns off tomorrow. All right. Now, I was so nervous because, for one, it's Lane.
That was your big debut.
Yeah.
With him.
For one, it's for Lane. And two, it's representing his dad.
Who just passed away.
Who just passed away in Vermont.
This is a big deal.
And I was lost sleep over it. I was like,
bet.
oh, no.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure.
I didn't tell Lane what I had in mind. I told him, I said, it's going to be a pedestal now. And I said, that's all I'm telling you.
Yeah.
He goes, okay. And I did it up. Buck looks like he just stood up out of his bed. Snow all over him. I even put ice particles in his whiskers. The whole nine works. Everything I could do.
Nice.
Put him in the snow. And I brought the trailer up. And still, Lane he doesn't know what's coming. And I had a wooden plaque made up, hand-carved, in memory of Larry Benoit, with the buck track right there. He didn't know I was doing that.
That's a good touch.
And I took the blanket off the top, and he just goes, you nailed it. It was like, sweet, Felt good right there.
I tell you what, Lane talked about like the whiskers on it.
Yeah.
Had like the dew on it, like where a deer would be breathing heavy.
That's crazy.
Lane looked at that and he was just like, I've never seen anything like that. He said he knocked it out of the park. And he kept on giving me a hug. He says, thanks for finding Kyle.
Yeah. And
I said, no, Kyle found me.
and the base was a little bigger than what we would have liked, because Lane's like, I don't know where I'm going to put this at the booth. He goes, my booth's full. And we're sitting there looking at it. We had it inside the show at this point. It's first thing in the morning. No one's there yet. And Fred Allard was walking by, the guy that runs it.
Yeah, I know Fred.
He was like, what's this, Buck? And Lane, oh, this kid did it. He said, did it for Dad. And he goes, I just don't know where I'm going to put it. He goes, I know right where you're putting it. Lane goes, well, where do you want it? He goes, right at the front door.
It was the first thing you saw when you came in.
Smokes. This is the second deer I did third deer I did for Lane. Now everyone's going to see it. And I had so many people come up.
That was good exposure.
Yeah. They're like, you do that deer out in the front? I said, I sure did. He goes, everyone. It looks awesome. So I just can't explain the feeling. It was awesome.
How's business been since then?
It's taken off. It's been crazy.
And he's doing it full time.
Yeah.
A trip to North Carolina to test Lane's skills.
Yeah. That guy that we went to North Carolina to spend the time with, he was just, he was smitten. He met Lane at that North Carolina thing, and he kept telling us, well, that all works fine up there in them mountains up there. He said, but that don't work down here in South Carolina because you're down here in a swamp. So Lane and I get down there, and we get maps of his property, and Lane's just like, I don't know how to funnel him through this stuff. I said, I was stationed down in Florida. I used to deer hunt down in Florida. I said, well, look at the aerial maps, and we'll look for the Ponderosa pines, and then they'll follow the edges of that. We'll start there. So we started in there, and then after Lane got in there, as soon as he got on a track, it didn't matter what kind of topography it was. He was like a dog.
Right.
The biggest thing we had to do there was we started taking pictures of all the deer tracks that we saw, because we didn't know what a big deer was for North Carolina.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you're going into a totally different size of deer. There's no rocks, so their hoofs aren't getting rounded off.
Right.
Even the bucks have pointed toes. Right. Everything was, so we just started studying the stuff, and by day 3, Lane and I were like, yep, we know where we're going to go. And the guy's just like, well, where? And this guy had like 6 different pieces of property. And Lane and I walked every day the first 3 days. And when we pinpointed the 3 spots that we were going to sit, that guy's like, how the hell you guys do that? He says, out of 300 acres, he says, you boys picked my 3 favorite hunting spots. It's because what he does works where you're at, too.
Right.
And that made a believer out of me with a lot of it, too, because I had seen it. I was used to it in Pennsylvania, New England, where you're doing the funnels, you're doing the bogs, you're doing your water sources, and, you're looking at aerial photography for where your hardwoods meets the cedar bogs. That's easy. But then when you're taking that skill set and you're moving it out to Wisconsin, where it's cornfields, and being able to pattern it, and then you're taking it from there and you're going to Minnesota, and it's clear cut timber, flat,
Right.
and then taking it to North Carolina, where it's swamp, swamp bogs, and the same thing works in every one of the spots. You got some.
Think like a deer.
Yeah.
That's what he always told me. You gotta think like a buck.
Gotta think like a buck.
Lane, I can't do that.
What do they do? He says they do 2 things.
Yeah.
He says they screw and they eat.
Yeah.
He says you find the does. He says you're always going to find a buck.
A tour with a lady and Google.
And I can't remember how many different times Lane and I were tracking, especially up in Maine. We can go 2-3 days in his favorite parts of Maine, where we wouldn't see a deer track. Mm-hmm. Not anything. Coyotes, and then no deer track. We'd come up on a doe track, and they'd be like, okay, suit up. I was like, what's up? He said, we're going to let this lady give us a tour for the day. We're going to follow her around. And it worked every single time. We'd follow that doe for 6 hours. We'd find a doe first thing in the morning. If we didn't find anything for 2 days straight, third day, first thing in the morning, the first deer track we found, we were on it.
Wow.
And we'd follow it all day. Mm-hmm. And we always found pockets of deer like that. Always. It wasn't always right where we started. And a lot of times if we had, when I first started with Lane, I had a smartphone. And he'd always think I was texting my girlfriend, which I was a lot.
And you still do it.
And he would give me a hard time about using my smartphone when we were tracking. And we had this one buck that crossed this road, and he's just like, man, he says, he said, it'd be nice if there was a logging road down there or something. He says, we'd drive down there and see if he crossed, kind of cut it. He says, this track here is about 3 hours old. So I pulled up, Google Earth on my smartphone, zoomed it up, and I was like, well, this is where we're at. This is where this other logging road's right now. How'd you do that? The next year he had a smartphone. Yeah. But we started using that, how to hopscotch the deer to get ahead of them.
Kind of makes you wonder, like, if the Benoits had the technology that we have today when they were in heyday.
And the
knowledge.
And the density that the deer were in
back
those
then.
heydays. Yeah.
Like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
And Lane would have a 200-incher. No problem.
Yeah.
The cycle of the herd and cedar bogs.
What's that?
Then we'll have a deer shortage.
Well, we already do.
Yeah.
We do now. It goes in cycles. Yeah. Each state goes in an ebb and a flow. And Lane was actually starting to get excited about Vermont.
Was he?
Because the last 2 years, we saw an increase. And Lane was just like, man, he says, it's on the upswing again. 4 more years, man. He says, we're going to, it's going to be the honey hole again that it was when I was a kid. And the same thing was happening to us up in Maine, the area that we're in Maine. And it goes by when the logging companies log and how far it goes through the growth pattern. The deer are in the growth the first 2 to the second year through the, 4th year, really heavy. And then the moose move into it after that because it's taller, Yeah. But just the nature of the way hunters hit a piece of ground with the clear cut, they'll all be in there in that 4th year. And then after that, when it starts to die off and there's nothing in there, guys just give up on it. Well, by the time that thing hits 20 years, they're nut-bearing trees again.
Right.
And they're dropping. And then you got all these guys that just totally gave up on the spot because, oh, man, we went there 10 years ago. It sucked.
Right.
And they get in that mindset where, Lane would revisit those spots just to see what what came back is the dominant growth, because sometimes you're going to get the conifers that come in dominant. Other times you're going to get, the birches and softwoods that are non-nut bearing.
Right. So almost like a 20-year cycle after a cut.
It's almost like a 20-year cycle when it really starts to come back on. And he said, when in doubt, if you had a good spot before, go to the cedar bogs closest. Because those deer are going to
you won't forget either.
Yeah, they'll gravitate to that swamp. Because they'll eat cedar. Cedar rebounds. They start off quicker. And they eat them off. And it's a safe haven. Before I started hunting with Lane, I never even thought of hunting in swamps. I did when I lived in Florida because that's all there was.
Right.
But as far as Northwoods, if somebody told me...
Hardwoods.
Yeah, 6 years ago, open hardwoods.
Yeah.
That's what my dad taught me. I mean, Lane was just like, the only time you're going to see a buck in open hardwoods is late at night, or if he's running through it to get away from a hunter.
Right.
Or if he's chasing a doe.
Right.
Yeah, I got taught that same lesson.
Yeah, a lot of people do.
But yeah, out of the 5 years I hunted with Lane, I spent more time in bogs than anything. Yeah. I mean, there was another spot that Lane and I found in Maine that I'm going to leave mentionless that I would bring any of you guys to.
What are those GPS coordinates again, Paul?
That Lane and I literally said next year we're bringing our chest waders, because we went in there and it was up over our knees, and Lane was just like, they're in the middle. He says, we're bringing chest waders next year. We're getting in there.
Paul, the beaver blind builder, and chewing tobacco.
Lane didn't like tree stands.
No, Lane was scared to death of heights. Oh, my God. We had this one ground blind that we made this year on top of a boulder. Yeah. I mean, it was a boulder. It was like 2 stories high boulder. And it was like half in the ground. And there was a big ponderosa pine, or a big pine, big white pine actually, that was leaning up against it. And that was the only way I got him up there. Because I was like, well, I'll go up there and I'll build a blind up there so that you're not going to fall over. I'll get some bigger things. So I was like the beaver. Anytime Lane and I did any ground sitting, I'd just be like, just sit here. I'll get it. I could build a blind quicker than anything. And I'd get up there and he'd be like, oh, yeah, I can sit in this. Yeah. He hated sitting. Yeah. He'd give his dad a hard time for sitting there fidgeting the last couple of years. Lane was just as bad. He'd be sitting there flicking sticks. And this last year, I started chewing tobacco just to show him how loud it was. We're sitting in the stand. He's got a chew in, and I'd hold my spit until he spit. He'd go, and I go right after. He's just like, you got to be so noisy? So I'm just doing exactly what you're doing. Actually, I'm spitting a little quieter than you. I said, let's see who can spit the quietest, Lane. Then we started doing that. Seeing who could spit the quietest. Because, when we're hunting these smaller pieces and we're stuck in a blind,
right,
a ground blind, we're waiting for the deer to come through this funnel. We're hunting really small pieces of ground.
Right.
We're in there 6-7 hours.
Right.
We got this thing where we started doing this thing where we'd like we started off with just like taking a soda can, or I always was drinking seltzer. And then we'd aim for the can, and we'd put it farther and farther away, about 10 feet away. Then Lane was just like, real technical difficulties if you put it about 5 feet away, and we put a pine cone off it, and you can spit the pine cone off without knocking the can over. The guy was a dead-eye.
That's funny.
That was his favorite thing besides deer hunting.
Yeah. He loved to chew.
Lane's grocery store alter ego.
Lane had this, what I called the grocery store alter ego. Where he'd start walking around, and he'd get a little pep in his step, and he'd be whistling, and he'd start singing. He was like jolly, and for those of us who knew Lane really close, he was kind of, grumpy,
right?
So to have him do this entire swing, it was funny. I'd like record it on my smartphone, and I'd play it back for him later on after we had a few cocktails. Well, I started this 2 years ago. Every time we'd start looking for a new spot, and I could just tell Lane was looking for a spot, like he wanted to go over the mountain. He always had to see what was on the other side. Yeah. And when we got out of the truck, the kid song, "The bear went over the mountain, the bear went over the mountain." I started singing, Lane went over the mountain, oh, Lane went over the... And then he started going with it. So then I'd take the camera and I'd hold it out the window doing a selfie on the two of us singing that. And I got another selfie of Lane and I singing that song from Beverly Hillbillies. You know, where, oh, where are you tonight?
Oh, yes.
Why did you leave me here all alone? I searched the world over and thought I found true love. You found another and he was gone.
I ain't old enough for that.
Yeah, it was on Hee Haw when I was a kid.
The facade of Lane and Larry Benoit.
Well, you know, Lane was used to people taking advantage of him.
He was.
So he built this facade up, and it took him a while for it to drop down even with me, you know. I mean, his dad, when Larry first met me, the first whole year, Larry was just kind of like, you know, he couldn't figure out, okay, this guy went out and spent $5,000 of his own money to buy his own camera equipment. He doesn't charge us for filming.
Right.
He buys his own hunting licenses. You know, what's in it for him?
Right.
You know, and I would tell Larry, you know, I said, Larry, I'm living a dream. You know, I'm documenting history here. You guys are my heroes, and I don't need a paycheck.
Right.
You know, I mean, one of the things I learned over in Iraq is, you know, you enjoy what you love and do what you love. And you know,
right.
I said, you know, I lost enough friends over there that I'm happy to just enjoy what I'm doing right now.
Enjoy the moment. Yep.
And after I shared that with Larry, he kind of dropped his guard. But for the longest time, man, he'd just sit there and he'd watch me. What's his motive?
Old Eagle Eye had.
Well, because they've been burned so many times, you know. But it was really neat when, you know, the end of Larry's life, being able to, you know, when Larry was sick, and I'd just get to go over to his house and sit there and watch black and white cowboy movies with him.
Right.
Just sit on the couch and sit there and watch old John Wayne flicks and Bonanza and stuff for hours.
Right.
I remember sitting there just, you know, the room's dark and it's in the temple, what I call, you know, Larry's living room with all them bucks.
Right.
And I remember just sitting there watching these black and white movies, and I'm just sitting here looking over. Lane's sleeping, snoring with his mouth open. And I'm looking over there, and there's Larry Benoit. I'm sitting on the couch watching old westerns with Lane Benoit and Larry Benoit. And I'm just like pinching myself. You know, like, we gotta be kidding me.
This is not happening right now. That must have been amazing.
Yeah. And then, you know, and then there's different times, you know, when Larry, when we were at camp and Larry needed to go upstairs, he couldn't walk up the stairs really well.
Yeah.
And I remember up in Maine twice, you know, he's like, get over here, son. You know, he called me son and put his arm around me, and I help him up the steps and pat me on the back and say I was a good kid, you know.
Damn.
Yeah, it made my whole life, you know.
Right.
Spent my whole life sitting there reading about these guys, and then to
get in their world as intimately as you did, that's something else.
Slipped in it.
A spiritual side in a medicine bag.
After he killed a deer, he'd always thank the Lord, thank God. He wasn't a church-going guy, but he had reverence for it. Larry would actually, you know, go through this whole thing of, you know, my brother Buck, thank you for giving your life, you know, sustenance that you give my family, and have respect for everything that you've done in the woods. And then Larry would take some of the blood, he'd paint it on his face. Mm-hmm. And Lane and I did that the last year.
So that's the native thing?
Yeah. And I started, I don't know, probably my third year into it, kind of wearing my medicine bag and different things from that I'd learned.
That's right. I saw you wear that thingy.
That I'd put
Lane
different things that I'd learned.
Interesting.
And I'd put in my medicine bag.
Too. He carried a little sock.
One of the last things I put in my medicine bag there when Lane and I were up in Maine, it was this one particular buck. We knew it was the same buck. We had tracked him 3 different years. And he was in this really nasty swamp. That was the one that he said we were going in next year with chest waders. And we hunted him 3 weeks this year. And halfway through the first week, he raked a tree about the size of a coffee can, about 2 feet, and just kind of cut it up. It wasn't really shredded. And then the deer was in a 3-day cycle. So 3 days later, he comes back, and that tree is just shredded all the way around to like fine fibers. And then the next day after that, or the next 3-day cycle that the buck came through, he hit another set of trees right next to it. And his tines were so tall that the other trees that were really close. But anyway, the buck's antlers had gotten on that.
Yeah.
And the day before we left, You know, the amount of time that we put into that one particular buck, and we had let a lot of other ones go. Lane and I went back to that tree, and Lane took his knife and he cut some of the fiber off of it, and he twisted it up, and he says, "There you go. There's something for your bag." He says, "We honor the respect of what that thing did."
Interesting.
And got a couple different things in my bag, but now I got a piece of wood fiber.
Wood fiber.
I had a whole bunch of it. I had it packed in,
Yeah.
and I actually took some of it out. And I wetted it down and braided it and made a couple different ones.
Yeah. Seems.
I know a couple different guys that carry medicine bags that were really close to Lane that I gave one of the guys some of that.
Gotcha. A medicine bag is just a pouch that you carry.
It's a little leather pouch.
Memories and
that I wear
thoughts.
around my neck.
Yep.
And different milestones for me in my hunting. Are things that I put in. Like one of the things I have in it is a bear claw from my first black bear I got.
Okay.
And I've got a flint broadhead in there, the very first flint broadhead that I made and actually killed a deer with.
Gotcha.
Is in there.
So little artifacts and
I've got a cloth patch from the day I shot my first buck with a black powder. I took one of my patches out of my thing and
Interesting. That's cool. I like that.
Yeah, and it kind of, if you look at some of the older Benoit videos, you'll see Larry has a deer ear, part of a deer ear, tied to the front of his gun. And that was to remind him, in his spiritual act of the engagement of hunting. It was almost like a spiritual act in it, becoming one with the woods and pursuing the animal. That to keep you mindful of the deer's hearing because it's so acute. I mean, it's the first thing that gives you away with a deer. They say, Larry told me, he said, Native American Indian proverb is that if a leaf falls in the woods, a deer will hear it, a bear will smell it, and a turkey will see it.
Interesting.
We had quite a time talking about Lane and sharing stories and listening to Paul talk about all the little things he learned about Lane, spending as much time as he did in the woods with a camera on him, day in, day out, eating with Lane, hanging out with Lane, talking to Lane, driving with Lane everywhere he went. Most appreciative to Paul for opening up and telling us his story that he had, spending time with Lane over the last several years. During dinner, there was a loud thud that came from upstairs. Nobody knew what it was. Still don't know what it is today, but I have to believe that perhaps it was Lane exiting the North American Tracker staff, saying somehow that everything's going to be okay. So thanks for tuning in to the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Deer Hunting Podcast, episode number 100, a tribute to Lane Benoit, part 2. Tune in tomorrow for part 3, where we release the final episode of the 3-part tribute to Lane Benoit. This time, it's the interview with Lane himself. This is Jay Scott from the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Deer Hunting Podcast. See you tomorrow. Can't wait.